What I'm about to share with you is something that's been happening right under our noses, something that's affecting thousands of pilots across America right now, and yet the mainstream media has been absolutely silent about it. This isn't just another aviation story. This is about broken promises, shattered dreams, and a regulatory system that just pulled the rug out from underneath some of the most experienced aviators in the world. And if you're thinking about a career in aviation, or if you know someone who flies, you need to hear every single word of what I'm about to tell you, because this changes everything. Before I reveal what's really going on, I need you to understand something crucial. What the FAA has done, what Congress has allowed to happen, it's created a situation that nobody saw coming. Pilots who thought they had years left in their careers, who made financial decisions based on certain assumptions, who turned down other opportunities because they believed they could keep flying, they've been blindsided. And the implications of this go far beyond just the cockpit. This affects airlines, charter operations, your ticket prices, and the entire future of commercial aviation in America. Now, you might have heard something about pilot retirement ages in the news recently. Maybe you caught a headline here or there. But what you haven't heard is the full story. You haven't heard about the secret lobbying that went on behind closed doors. You haven't heard about the legal battles that are erupting right now in federal courts. You haven't heard about the pilots who received termination notices in the mail after decades of flawless service. And you definitely haven't heard about the loophole that some companies are exploiting that's creating a two-tier system in American aviation. Let me paint you a picture of what's happening right now, at this very moment, across the country. Imagine you're a pilot. You've spent 40 years in the cockpit. You've logged tens of thousands of hours. You've flown through storms, navigated emergencies, and brought passengers safely home countless times. You turn 65, and under current FAA regulations for commercial airlines, your career at the major carriers came to an end. But here's the thing. You still felt sharp. You still passed your medical exams with flying colors. You still had that passion for aviation burning inside you. So you made a decision. You took a job with a charter company or a fractional operator, companies that fly private jets for wealthy clients and corporations. And for years, this was the dream retirement. Better schedules, more time at home, still doing what you love. Then one day, without warning, everything changed. And that's where this story really begins. For decades, the world of aviation has operated under a fairly straightforward set of rules when it comes to age. If you flew for the major airlines, the big carriers like American, Delta, or United, you had to retire at 65. This wasn't always the case. The rule used to be 60. But back in 2007, Congress raised it to 65, bringing the United States in line with international standards set by the International Civil Aviation Organization. This was considered progress. It recognized that pilots were living longer, staying healthier, and that with modern medicine and better health screening, experienced aviators could safely fly well into their 60s. But here's what most people don't know. That age limit of 65 only applied to Part 121 operations. That's the regulatory designation for scheduled airline service, the flights you book on websites and apps. For other types of flying, specifically Part 91 and Part 135 operations, there was no mandatory retirement age at all. Part 91 covers private flying, like when a company owns its own jet. Part 135 covers charter operations and fractional ownership programs like NetJets, where wealthy individuals and corporations essentially buy shares of aircraft. For pilots in these operations, age was never a barrier. You could fly as long as you maintained your medical certificate and the company wanted to employ you. This created an incredible opportunity for airline pilots hitting that 65 milestone. They would retire from the airlines, often with a generous pension, and then immediately get hired by charter operators or fractional companies. They'd work another 5, 10, sometimes even 15 years. Some pilots flew well into their 70s and even 80s. It was the perfect second act. The experience these pilots brought was invaluable. They'd seen everything. They knew how to handle difficult passengers, how to manage complex weather situations, how to land at tiny airports that don't show up in airline route networks. Companies loved hiring them, and passengers felt safer knowing they had someone with that much experience up front. Then Congress got involved, and everything started to fall apart. In December of 2022, buried deep in a massive omnibus spending bill that was over 4,000 pages long, a provision appeared that would change the game entirely. This wasn't debated on the floor of Congress. This wasn't something that aviation experts weighed in on publicly. It was inserted quietly, and according to pilots' unions and industry insiders, it was put there for one specific company. That company was NetJets, the world's largest private jet operator. The provision stated that Part 91K and Part 135 operators who logged at least 75,000 turbojet operations per year could voluntarily establish a mandatory retirement age of 70 for their pilots. At first glance, this might seem reasonable, even generous. After all, it extended the retirement age beyond the airline limit of 65. But here's the twist that nobody expected. Once a company chose to implement this age limit, they couldn't reverse it. Ever. It became permanent. And if you were already employed and you were over 70, you were out immediately. In January of 2023, NetJets announced they would be implementing this policy. They gave their pilots notice that the age 70 limit would take effect in exactly 1 year, and on January 10th, 2024, approximately 100 pilots received termination notices. These weren't pilots with poor performance records. These weren't pilots who had failed medical exams or had safety violations. These were pilots who had, in many cases, been with the company for decades, who had spotless records, and who happened to be over 70 years old. The reaction was swift and furious. The NetJets Association of Shared Aircraft Pilots, the union representing these aviators, immediately challenged the terminations. They argued that this violated the Railway Labor Act, which governs labor relations in the airline industry. They filed for an injunction in federal court in Texas to stop the terminations. But the legal system moved slowly, and by the time judges were hearing arguments, those pilots were already gone from the schedule. The arbitrator rejected the union's challenge. The federal court refused to grant the preliminary injunction. In the court's view, the pilots had failed to establish that their claims were likely to succeed on the merits. Just like that, 100 careers were over. 100 pilots who had dedicated their lives to aviation, who had planned their retirements around the ability to keep flying, found themselves grounded permanently. And the implications rippled far beyond just those 100 individuals. Now here's where it gets even more complex, and this is the part that should concern everyone, whether you're in aviation or not. While this was happening in the charter and fractional world, an entirely different battle was being fought over airline pilots. For years, there had been talk about raising the mandatory retirement age for airline pilots from 65 to 67. Proponents argued this was necessary because of a severe pilot shortage. In the wake of the pandemic, airlines were struggling to find enough qualified pilots to meet the surging demand for air travel. Regional airlines, which serve smaller cities and feed passengers to the major hubs, were hit particularly hard. Some were cancelling routes and reducing service because they simply didn't have enough pilots. Senators and representatives began pushing legislation called the Let Experienced Pilots Fly Act, which would raise the retirement age to 67. Supporters pointed to the fact that people were living longer and healthier lives. They argued that with proper medical screening, pilots in their late 60s could fly safely. Some even pointed out that it seemed arbitrary to allow charter pilots to fly until 70 while forcing airline pilots to retire at 65. But the proposal faced massive opposition, and this is where the story takes another crucial turn. The FAA itself came out against raising the age limit. In a letter to Congress, FAA Administrator Michael Whitaker explicitly warned lawmakers not to raise the retirement age until the agency could conduct comprehensive studies on whether older pilots would create safety risks. This was significant. The regulatory body responsible for aviation safety was essentially saying, pump the brakes. We need to look at this more carefully. The major pilot unions also came out strongly against the proposal. The Airline Pilots Association, which represents over 80,000 airline pilots, launched an intensive lobbying campaign to defeat the measure. They released detailed position papers outlining their concerns, and their arguments were compelling. First, they pointed out that the rationale for raising the retirement age no longer existed. The pilot shortage that everyone had been worried about in 2022 had largely resolved itself by 2024. In fact, Spirit Airlines had furloughed 330 pilots. American, Delta, and United had all slowed or completely halted pilot hiring. The data showed a clear oversupply of pilots in the system, not a shortage. Second, and this was perhaps the most powerful argument, raising the retirement age would create massive operational chaos because of international regulations. The International Civil Aviation Organization, which sets global aviation standards that virtually every country follows, mandates that pilots must retire at 65 for international flights. If the United States raised its limit to 67, American pilots over 65 would be prohibited from flying to Canada, Mexico, the Caribbean, and any other international destination. Nearly half of pilots at major carriers between 60 and 65 fly wide-body aircraft on international routes. If those pilots couldn't fly internationally after 65, airlines would have to retrain them for domestic-only routes. This would create a cascading effect, displacing younger pilots, creating training backlogs, and generating enormous costs for airlines. Third, the unions presented medical data that was hard to ignore. At American Airlines, 71% of pilots on long-term disability were over 55, and 84% were over 50. While this didn't mean older pilots were inherently unsafe, it did suggest that age-related health issues were a real factor that needed to be carefully studied before making major policy changes. The battle came to a head during the debate over the FAA Reauthorization Act of 2024. This is a massive piece of legislation that authorizes over $105 billion in funding for the FAA through 2028. It covers everything from air traffic control hiring to passenger protection rules to aircraft production oversight. The House version of the bill, which passed in July of 2023, included language that would raise the pilot retirement age to 67. But as the bill moved to the Senate, the opposition intensified. Senator Maria Cantwell, Democrat from Washington and chair of the Senate Commerce Committee, became a key voice against the provision. She released a public statement saying that aviation safety is paramount and now is not the time to take a shortcut. The FAA had made clear that scientific and safety analysis must come first, and that simply hadn't happened. When the final version of the FAA Reauthorization Act was passed by both chambers and signed into law by President Biden on May 16, 2024, the provision to raise the retirement age had been stripped out entirely. On the surface, this looked like a victory for the unions and for those who prioritize safety over addressing workforce issues. But here's the paradox that nobody seems to be talking about. While Congress rejected raising the age for airline pilots amid safety concerns and international complications, it had already given charter and fractional operators the green light to require retirement at 70, and there was no requirement for additional safety studies there either. In fact, the very same omnibus bill that created the age 70 option for charter pilots didn't mandate any new research or oversight, so we now have a bizarre two-tier system. If you fly for American Airlines, Delta, or United, you must retire at 65. But if you fly private jets for NetJets or other large charter operators, you can be forced to retire at 70. Except that's not quite right either, because remember, the age 70 limit is optional, and once implemented, it's permanent. So some companies have implemented it and some haven't. This means we have pilots doing essentially the same job, flying similar aircraft, with similar responsibilities, but facing completely different age requirements depending on who their employer is and what choices that employer has made. And this is where the broken promises come in. Thousands of pilots had made career decisions based on the understanding that they could fly in the Part 135 world without age restrictions. They turned down opportunities at airlines specifically because they didn't want to face mandatory retirement. They planned their finances around being able to work longer. They moved their families to be near charter bases. And then the rules changed mid-career. For the pilots at NetJets, who were terminated in January of 2024, the sense of betrayal runs deep. Many of them had joined the company decades earlier, before it was even acquired by Berkshire Hathaway and became the behemoth it is today. They'd been told implicitly, and in some cases explicitly, that they could fly as long as they maintained their medical certification and performed their duties competently. They'd seen colleagues in their 70s and even 80s still flying. Some pilots had turned down lucrative offers from airlines, knowing they'd have to retire at 65, specifically because NetJets offered them the chance to fly longer. And then, with 12 months' notice, that promise evaporated. The lawsuit filed by terminated NetJets pilots is ongoing, but legal experts suggest their chances of success are limited. The court has already indicated it doesn't believe their claims are likely to prevail. The company is arguing that Congress explicitly gave them the authority to set this age limit, and that they followed all the proper procedures in implementing it. The pilots counter that this was a violation of their collective bargaining agreement, and that the company should have negotiated this change rather than unilaterally imposing it. But so far, the legal system has sided with the company. Beyond NetJets, other large charter operators are watching closely. Some, like FlexJet, might meet the threshold of 75,000 jet operations per year and could implement the same policy. Smaller operators, those below the threshold, still have no mandatory retirement age at all. This creates competitive dynamics that nobody fully understands yet. If you're a 68-year-old pilot, you might be able to work for a mid-sized charter company, but not for the largest operators. This could create a talent drain, with the most experienced pilots ending up at smaller companies, or it could mean those pilots simply can't find work at all. There's another angle to this that's even more troubling when you dig into it. Critics of the age 70 mandate suspect that NetJets pushed for this provision not primarily out of safety concerns, but for financial reasons. Pilots at NetJets have strong union representation and earn good salaries. They also have medical benefits that cover their spouses, and the company self-insures that medical coverage. Older pilots and their older spouses generate higher medical costs. Additionally, some senior pilots were allegedly on partial paid medical leave with no real intention of returning to full-time flying, and the company had limited ability to terminate them under the existing collective bargaining agreement. By implementing the age 70 limit, NetJets could address multiple issues at once. They could cut their medical costs, they could remove pilots who were on long-term leave, and they could create openings for younger pilots who would work for relatively lower salaries and wouldn't have spouses on the medical plan yet. It's a coldly pragmatic business calculation disguised as a safety measure, according to the union representatives and some of the terminated pilots. The irony is thick here. At the same time that major airlines are arguing that they don't need to raise the retirement age because there's actually an oversupply of pilots now, NetJets claimed they needed to remove pilots over 70. If there's such an oversupply, why would any company voluntarily shrink their pilot pool? The answer likely has less to do with availability and more to do with cost management and labor relations. But let's step back and look at the bigger picture, because this isn't just a story about one company or 100 pilots. This is a story about the future of commercial aviation in America and about how regulatory policy gets made in an era of massive spending bills and behind-the-scenes lobbying. First, consider the pilot shortage narrative. For years, we heard dire warnings that America was facing a catastrophic shortage of pilots. Regional airlines testified before Congress about their inability to fill cockpits. Consulting firms produced reports projecting massive shortfalls. And based on these warnings, policies were proposed, including raising the retirement age. But now, just 2 years later, the shortage has apparently evaporated. Airlines are furloughing pilots and cancelling training classes. What happened? Part of it was the natural market correction after the post-pandemic surge in travel. Part of it was that the pipeline of new pilots, which takes years to develop, finally started producing more graduates. But this raises serious questions about how we make long-term policy based on short-term labor market fluctuations. Second, consider the international dimension. The United States has always been a leader in aviation safety, and part of that leadership has come from aligning with international standards set by ICAO. Every commercial pilot knows that aviation is inherently global. An aircraft registered in the US might fly to dozens of countries in a given year. Crews need to be able to operate internationally without facing a patchwork of different regulations. By keeping the retirement age at 65 for airlines, the US maintains that alignment. But by allowing charter operators to set different standards, we've created potential confusion. What happens when a NetJets aircraft flies internationally? The answer is that current international rules still apply, and pilots over 65 in those operations would face the same restrictions airline pilots do. But nobody seems to have thought through all the implications carefully. Third, and perhaps most fundamentally, this is a story about how labor policy gets made in America today. The provision that allowed charter operators to set a 70-year age limit wasn't debated in aviation committees. It wasn't subjected to hearings where safety experts could testify. It wasn't analyzed by the FAA before being enacted. It was inserted into a 4,000-page spending bill that members of Congress had mere hours to review before voting. This is unfortunately how much legislation happens now, and it means that profound changes to industries and people's lives can occur without proper scrutiny or debate. For the pilots affected by this, particularly those 100 who lost their jobs at NetJets, the consequences are severe and personal. Many are in their early to mid-70s. They're too old to easily transition to other careers. Many had planned to work another few years to maximize their retirement savings. Some have mortgages or other financial obligations they were counting on this income to cover. They have skills and experience that are suddenly worthless in the job market because of an arbitrary line drawn by Congress at the behest of their employer. The emotional toll is significant too. For pilots, flying isn't just a job, it's an identity. It's something many of them have done since their 20s, something that defines who they are. To have that taken away suddenly, not because they failed a medical exam or made a mistake, but because of a policy change, creates a profound sense of loss and anger. The younger pilots at these companies are watching all this nervously. They've seen what can happen. They've seen how quickly the rules can change and how little protection they may have. The union fought hard for the terminated pilots and lost. The courts sided with the company. If it could happen to senior pilots with decades of experience, it could happen to anyone. Meanwhile, the debate over airline pilot retirement age continues to simmer. Senators have vowed to reopen the discussion. Some lawmakers still believe that raising the age to 67 makes sense, particularly if the international community eventually moves in that direction. But ICAO has shown no interest in changing its standards, and without that international alignment, any US change would create the operational chaos that opponents warned about. Here's what makes this entire situation so frustrating. There are legitimate questions about whether our current pilot retirement ages make sense. Modern pilots are healthier than their predecessors. Medical technology allows us to detect and manage health conditions far better than we could in 1959 when the age 60 rule was first implemented, or even in 2007 when it was raised to 65. The blanket assumption that everyone should stop flying at the same age, regardless of their individual health and capability, does seem somewhat arbitrary. But if we're going to revisit these policies, it should be done thoughtfully, with proper research, with input from medical experts and safety specialists, and with consideration for how changes will affect international operations, training pipelines, airline economics, and individual pilots' careers. What we got instead was a hastily written provision in a spending bill that created different rules for different sectors of the industry, followed by a blanket rejection of changes for airline pilots without any path forward for a more nuanced discussion. The FAA, to its credit, recognized this and asked Congress to let it study the issue properly before making changes. That's the right approach. But Congress went ahead with changes for the charter sector anyway, and now we're living with the consequences. So where do we go from here? For the pilots who've been terminated, their options are limited. They can continue their lawsuit, though the early rulings haven't been encouraging. They can try to find work with smaller charter operators that haven't implemented age limits, though those opportunities are limited and often pay significantly less. Or they can retire earlier than they'd planned, with less financial security than they'd hoped for. For the industry, this creates uncertainty. Operators are trying to figure out their staffing strategies in an environment where the rules keep changing. Do they implement the age 70 limit now, while they have the option, even if they don't currently need it, just to have that tool available? Do they try to recruit retired airline pilots, knowing those pilots might only be able to work for them until 70 if they implement the limit? For Congress, the question is whether they've learned anything from this mess. Will they approach future aviation workforce policy more carefully, with proper study and debate? Or will we continue to see major changes buried in must-pass spending bills, enacted without thorough analysis of their consequences? And for the flying public, who largely has no idea any of this is happening, the question is whether the retirement age really matters for safety. The evidence suggests that properly screened and tested pilots can fly safely well into their 60s and even 70s. The bigger determinants of safety are training, currency, medical oversight, and operational procedures. Age is just one factor among many. The sad reality is that the dream that thousands of retired airline pilots had of extending their flying careers by moving to the charter world has been fundamentally altered. It's not dead entirely, but it's been severely constrained. And it happened through a process that was opaque, rushed, and seemingly driven more by one company's interests than by a thoughtful consideration of what's best for aviation safety and workforce stability. This is the story that nobody's really talking about. The mainstream media covered the debate about raising the airline pilot retirement age because that affected major carriers and potentially millions of passengers. But the charter sector, despite being a multi-billion-dollar industry, operates largely under the radar. The pilots who lost their jobs at NetJets aren't household names. There's no organized constituency advocating for them, and so their story has been largely ignored. But it's a story that matters. It matters because it shows how easily careers can be disrupted by policy changes made without adequate deliberation. It matters because it reveals the gap between rhetoric about pilot shortages and the reality of market dynamics. It matters because it demonstrates how companies can use regulatory changes to achieve labor relations objectives that they couldn't accomplish through normal negotiations. And it matters because thousands of current and future pilots need to understand that the rules of the game can change at any time, and the promises that are made to them today may not hold tomorrow. The pilots who've been affected by this aren't asking for sympathy. They're professionals who understood that aviation careers come with risks and uncertainties. But they are asking for fairness, for consistency, and for policy to be made through a transparent process that considers their perspectives and their livelihoods. On those counts, the system has failed them spectacularly. As this story continues to unfold, with ongoing lawsuits and continuing debates about retirement age policy, one thing is clear. The dream of flying well into your 70s in the charter world is no longer the sure thing it once was. For some, that dream has already ended abruptly and painfully. For others, it hangs in the balance, dependent on decisions their employers might make at any time. And for an entire generation of pilots planning their careers, it's a stark reminder that in aviation, as in life, the only constant is change. And sometimes that change comes when you least expect it, and in ways you never prepared for. This is the untold story of how the FAA, or more accurately, how Congress acting on the FAA's regulatory framework, killed the dream of thousands of retired pilots. And now, you know what nobody else is talking about.